Okay, so for this deep dive, I want to take you to a very specific spot on the map, a very specific moment in time.
Let's do it.
The date is October 3rd, 1502. We're in the water just off the Malabar coast of India.
Right, the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. And the air is just heavy. You know that thick tropical humidity that just, it feels like it's clinging to your skin?
Oh, yeah, oppressive.
It's that, but there's something else cutting through the salt spray. Something sharp.
It's a smell, isn't it? Before you see anything, you'd smell it. It's acrid. It's chemical.
What is that?
It's the smell of burning pitch, tar! And it's a smell that means something is being destroyed.
And then if we look through that haze, we see the source. There's this massive ship, a merchant vessel called the Meri, or sometimes the Miri.
A huge ship for its time.
And it is completely surrounded. There's a ring of, what, 20 Portuguese warships just circling it, tightening the noose.
Yeah, an entire armada.
And what's happening on the deck of that ship and below it? Well, it is absolutely not what you find in the Age of Discovery chapter of a high school textbook.
No, not even close. I mean, this isn't the painting of the brave explorer pointing heroically at the horizon. This is a crime scene.
A crime scene. That's a powerful way to put it.
And if we're going to be honest about history, we have to look at it as that. Because usually when we talk about 1502 and the Indian Ocean, the narrative is very, very clean.
Right. It's all about progress.
It's about navigation. It's about, star charts and better shipbuilding. It's about connecting the East and the West for the first time.
It's the hero's journey, Vasco da Gama, the admiral of the seas.
Exactly. And he is the central figure here. He's the man commanding that ring of warships. He's a titan of Western history. I mean, you have bridges named after him, statues in Lisbon, public squares, plaques in India.
He's put on the same level as Columbus and Magellan.
He is. He's part of that pantheon, the man who supposedly opened the world.
I can picture the maps in my old social studies textbook.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the little dotted lines going from Portugal down around Africa and then over to India. It was always presented as this incredible triumph of the human spirit. Right. A commercial breakthrough.
And it was a breakthrough, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But the source material we're looking at today, which, and I really have to stress this point, is not hostile propaganda from his enemies.
That's the crucial part.
It's from the Portuguese themselves. It's their own military logs, their own chronicles, and they paint a very, very different picture of what that breakthrough actually required.
So that's the real hook for this deep dive, isn't it? We aren't relying on some modern revisionist take or a counter-narrative written hundreds of years later.
No.
We're basically looking at the police report filed by the guys who lit the match.
We are reading the perpetrator's diaries. That's what makes this so chilling. We're diving into the destruction of the Meri, which is an incident that has been, let's say, conveniently edited out of the heroic version of da Gama's life for centuries.
But the men who did it.
Oh, they documented it. They documented it with this cold clinical precision that is just, it's breathtaking.
So our mission today is to try to understand what European expansion actually looked like on the ground, when the official court painters weren't around.
Yeah, what it looked like from the deck of the other ship.
We need to figure out how the Portuguese established their dominance in the Indian Ocean, and I'm guessing the answer is a lot darker than just better sailing.
It's not just darker, it's more complex. It's about economics, it's about religious zealotry, and ultimately it's about a very specific kind of violence that, if we saw it today, we would probably call terrorism.
Wow. Okay, so let's unpack the context first, because the Meri incident happens in 1502 on da Gama's second trip to India.
Right.
But to understand the sheer violence of that second trip, we have to talk about the first one. That was in 1497, 1498.
Yes.
And that first voyage, it gets sold as this huge success, but in reality, it was kind of disaster, wasn't it?
Disaster might be a little strong because he did find the route, which was the primary goal, but humiliation, that's dead on.
Humiliation.
Personal and national humiliation. And understanding that feeling is the absolute key to understanding everything that comes later. All the violence, all the terror. It's born from that first trip.
So what happened?
Well, you have to put yourself in the mindset of the Portuguese in 1498. They are coming from Europe, which, let's be brutally honest, was a bit of a backwater at the time compared to the major commercial hubs in Asia.
We tend to forget that, right? We have this very Eurocentric view of history, where Europe was always the center of the world.
But in 1498, it just wasn't. The Indian Ocean was the nexus. It was the center of the world economy. You had this incredibly sophisticated, centuries-old trade network connecting East Africa, the Arab world, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, all the way to China.
A globalized world, just not our version of it.
It was cosmopolitan, it was wealthy, the cities were enormous and rich. And here comes Vasco da Gama, sailing in with his 3 little ships, thinking he's about to blow everyone's minds.
He thinks he's the big shot coming to town. He represents the King of Portugal.
He thinks he represents the greatest, most powerful king on earth. He finally makes landfall in Calicut, which was this massive entrepot. The source calls it a city of spices. And the ruler there is the Zamorin. So da Gama finally gets an audience with him, and he comes bearing gifts to show the power and wealth of Portugal.
And this is where it all goes wrong. This is where it gets really awkward.
Painfully awkward. I mean, you have to look at the manifest of what da Gama actually brought with him. It's almost comical.
Who was on the list?
He brought lengths of striped cloth, some hoods. He brought sugar, oil, honey, and the kicker, he brought a few wash basins.
Wash basins? You're kidding.
Brass wash basins. Now, maybe if you show up in a small village in the Portuguese countryside, that's a nice gift.
Sure.
But you're in the court of the Zamorin of Calicut, where merchants are trading in chests of silk, in rubies, in high-grade porcelain, in the best pepper and cinnamon in the world, and you bring them a wash basin.
It's insulting.
It's worse than insulting. It's junk. The source material says the Zamorin's agents literally laughed at the Portuguese. They looked at this pile of stuff and said something like, "This isn't even fit for the poorest merchant in Mecca, let alone a powerful king."
That's like showing up to a billionaire's gala with a bag of off-brand potato chips.
It's worse than that. It's like showing up at the chips and then demanding they sign a multi-million-dollar exclusive trade deal with you. Because that's what he was there for.
So that has to just crush the ego.
It shattered the ego. And it wasn't just the pathetic gifts. The Portuguese had a fundamental economic problem. They had nothing to trade.
What do you mean?
They wanted spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, things that were worth more than gold in Europe, but they had no currency that the Indian merchants valued. Their silver wasn't pure enough, the standard was gold, and the Portuguese simply didn't have enough of it to buy anything in bulk.
So they show up with junk to give away and no money to buy anything.
Pretty much. So da Gama spends months there, basically being sidelined, mocked by the established Muslim merchants who controlled the spice trade, and treated like a common pirate or a beggar by the Zamorin's court.
And he's stuck there, isn't he? He can't just leave.
That's the other layer of humiliation. He's stuck because of the monsoon winds. He missed the window to sail back, so he has to sit there and just stew in this failure for months on end.
Oh, that's brutal.
By the time he finally gets back to Lisbon in 1499, and mind you, the trip back was horrific. Most of his crew died of scurvy. Yes, on one level, he's a national hero for finding the sea route.
The mission was a success.
The mission was a success, but personally, he is seething. He holds a deep, bitter, personal grudge against the Muslim merchants who laughed at him and against the Zamorin who dismissed him.
He felt disrespected. Deeply.
He felt that the King of Portugal, and by extension all of Christendom, had been insulted. So when King Manuel decides to send him back in 1502, the instructions are very, very different.
The exploration phase is over.
Completely. The gloves are off.
So this second voyage, it's not a diplomatic mission.
Not in any sense of the word. This was a conquest mission. The king's orders were explicit. Establish Portuguese dominance, punish the Zamorin of Calicut, make them respect the crown of Portugal. And this time, he gave da Gama the fleet to do it.
We're not talking about 3 little ships anymore.
No, we're talking about an armada. The sources say 20 ships. Some were heavily armed carracks, others were faster caravels, a force of somewhere between 800 and 1,000 men.
And these weren't just transport ships. These were warships.
These were state-of-the-art fighting vessels, packed with cannons. This fleet was designed for one thing: violence.
Okay, I want to dig into that fighting aspect because the textbook version of history often just glosses over the how. How do you force a massive, sophisticated market to trade with you when you have nothing they actually want to buy?
That is the central economic problem of the early Portuguese Empire. And their solution is what defined the next century. If you can't compete on price and you can't compete on the quality of your goods, you have to change the rules of the game.
How do you do that?
You stop being a merchant and you start being a racketeer.
A racketeer. Like the mob.
Exactly like the mob. Think about it. If a local business won't buy your protection, what do? You break their windows, you burn their trucks. The Portuguese looked at the Indian Ocean and realized their only comparative advantage was organized violence.
So their technology.
Specifically, their military technology. They had better artillery, their ships, the nares and caravels, were built for the rough North Atlantic. They were heavy, sturdy, deep-hulled ships.
Which meant they could carry a lot of weight.
A lot of weight, specifically a lot of heavy bronze cannons, and they could withstand the recoil from firing them.
Okay, so contrast that with the ships that were already in the Indian Ocean.
The Indian Ocean trade relied largely on ships called dhows. And these were incredible vessels, let's be clear. Beautifully designed for the predictable monsoon winds. They often had hulls that were sewn together with coconut fiber core instead of being nailed with iron.
Sewn together.
Yeah, which sounds flimsy, but it actually gave them incredible flexibility in the water and over coral reefs. They were fast and efficient, but they were not built for war.
What happens when a sewn-together hull meets a cannonball?
It shatters. They just weren't designed to withstand ship-to-ship artillery duels because, for the most part, nobody in the Indian Ocean was fighting that way. Trade was largely peaceful, enforced by customs and local rulers, not by naval bombardments.
So da Gama comes back in 1502 with basically a fleet of tanks ready to fight against an economy that's using luxury sedans.
That's a really good analogy. And his strategy, the one sanctioned by the king, was to use that military mismatch to terrify the entire market into submission.
How does that work?
The idea was, if he could make the ocean so dangerous that no one dared to sail without Portuguese permission, then he could control the entire spice trade without ever having to compete economically.
So he invents a problem piracy, his piracy, and then sells the solution.
Exactly. The solution was a Portuguese pass, called a cartaz. If you bought a cartaz, you paid a tax to the Portuguese crown and you were allowed to sail safely. If you were caught without one,
you were in trouble.
You were considered an enemy vessel. Your ship and cargo could be seized, your crew and passengers killed or enslaved. And that brings us directly to the Meri.
This wasn't a random encounter, was it? He was actively looking for a target to make an example of.
He was looking for a victim. It's early October, 1502. The fleet is patrolling the coast and they spot the Meri. Now, this was a massive ship. One of the Portuguese chroniclers called it a great ship, maybe 400 tons, chartered out of Calicut, a major prize.
And where was it coming from?
It was returning from Jeddah.
Yeah.
And this is the single most important detail that changes everything. Jeddah is the port city for Mecca.
So this is a pilgrim ship.
It is a pilgrim ship returning from the Hajj. This is the most sacred journey in Islam.
And how many people were on board?
The estimates are around 400 passengers. And we really need to pause here and think about who these people were. Because in the Portuguese logs, they are just Moors. It's this single, monolithic enemy.
But in reality?
In reality, these are families. They aren't soldiers. They aren't a military threat.
The sources are clear on that.
Very clear. There were wealthy merchants on board, yes, probably carrying their fortunes with them. But there were also religious scholars. There were women, there were children, there were elderly people, parents who had probably saved up their entire lives to make this one spiritual journey.
It's the absolute pinnacle of their lives, a sacred obligation fulfilled.
Exactly. I mean, try to imagine the mood on that ship. They've completed their sacred duty. They're carrying holy texts, maybe some water from the Zamzam, well, souvenirs and gifts for their families back home.
They're just a few days away from home.
They are exhausted, probably, but spiritually fulfilled. They're rehearsing the stories they'll tell their children and grandchildren about seeing the Kaaba. It's a mood of profound peace and anticipation.
The source material we're drawing from uses this narrative device to help us visualize this. It creates a composite character, a woman named Fatima bint Abdullah.
Right, and it's a useful device. While we don't have an actual passenger manifest with names, Fatima represents the demographic reality of that ship. She's not a historical person, but she represents hundreds of real people.
So we can imagine her, a 43-year-old merchant's wife, maybe a mother, traveling with her husband or her family.
She has just completed the spiritual journey of a lifetime. She is not a combatant. She is arguably the furthest thing from a military threat to the King of Portugal you could possibly imagine.
She's probably below deck, sorting through her things, feeling the ship rock, maybe smelling the land breeze getting closer. And then something changes.
The rhythm of the ship changes. The lookout shouts, and the Portuguese fleet intercepts them. Da Gama's 20 warships surround the single, slow-moving Meri.
Now, normally, in the maritime world, even then, when a warship catches a merchant ship, there's a protocol, right?
There is a sort of accepted set of rules. You surrender your vessel, they take your cargo, maybe they hold the wealthy passengers for ransom, but generally you live. It's a business transaction.
It's a robbery, but with rules.
Yes. And the captain of the Meri certainly thought so. He assumes this is just a very large-scale act of piracy. He's a pragmatist, he gets in a small boat, he's rowed over to the Gama's flagship, and he starts to negotiate.
And the offer he makes is just... it's staggering.
It is. The Meri was loaded. It was carrying a fortune in spices, precious stones, pearls, textiles. Plus, all the passengers had their personal wealth with them. The captain offers it all.
Everything.
He says, take the cargo. Take every last bit of it. Take the jewelry from the women. Take the ship itself. It's yours.
He's basically offering to have everyone strip naked and walk away with their lives.
Essentially, yes. And he goes even further. He offers to pay a massive ransom in the future. He says, if this isn't enough, name your price. The merchants of Calicut will pay it, whatever you ask. He begs da Gama. He makes the moral argument.
What's that?
He points out these are pilgrims. They are returning from the house of God in Mecca. They are not men of war. He's appealing to a shared sense of humanity, of religious sanctity.
But da Gama isn't interested in the money.
And that's the truly terrifying part of this whole encounter. A pirate wants money. A privateer wants cargo. Da Gama wanted something else entirely. He wanted a spectacle.
A spectacle of terror.
The source is explicit. Da Gama refused the loot. He refused the ransom. His goal was to send a message written in fire and blood to the Zamorin and to the entire Muslim trading world.
So he still orders the looting, but it's not for the profit itself.
Well, he's not a fool. He orders his men to go aboard, disarm the few guards on the Meri, and confiscate all the valuables. He's not going to let a fortune in gold and gems sink to the bottom of the ocean if he can help it. His men spent days transferring the cargo.
Yeah.
And then, once the ship is stripped bare of valuables, the final order comes down. Lock 'em up.
Lock him up where?
Drive every single person below deck into the main cargo hold.
I'm trying to picture the hold of a wooden sailing ship from the early 1500s. It's not exactly a passenger lounge.
No, it's a dungeon. It's a vast, dark, cavernous space.
Yeah.
It's damp, probably filthy, and with 400 people packed into it, it would have been incredibly cramped, suffocating.
And they heard them down there?
They heard them down, the men, the women, the children, the elderly, pushing them down the ladders into the dark. And then the Portuguese carpenters get to work on the main deck.
Doing what?
They board up the main hatches, they nail heavy planks over the exits, they seal every possible ventilation opening, they're systematically turning the ship into a prison.
They're building a coffin. A floating coffin.
They are turning the ship into an oven, because once every last person is trapped inside, da Gama gives the next order. He tells his men to bring up the pitch.
Pitch. Tar.
Exactly. Highly flammable, sticky black tar. It's impossible to put out once it really gets going with water. They pour it all over the wooden deck, they splash it down the sides of the hull, and then he gives the order to light the torches.
This isn't a quick death, is it? We're not talking about an explosion from gunpowder.
No. And that's what makes the accounts from the Portuguese chroniclers so deeply disturbing to read. The burning of the Meri seems to have lasted for days as it drifted, but the intense phase, the killing phase, was a slow, drawn-out agony. The sources suggest it took 4 hours.
4 hours.
4 hours of unimaginable horror. Just try to imagine being in that hold. The fire starts above you. At first, it's just the heat. The wooden ceiling, the deck above you starts to radiate warmth, then gets hotter and hotter.
And then the smoke.
Then the smoke. Tar smoke is not like wood smoke. It's thick, it's black, it's oily and toxic. It would have started pouring through the cracks in the deck immediately. People are choking, coughing, screaming, panicking, crushing each other in the pitch dark.
And they must have tried to get out.
Of course.
Yeah.
The human survival instinct is one of the most powerful forces there is. The source describes how passengers, probably the men, found axes or other tools in the hold and started trying to hack through the hull or to break open a hatch.
But the Portuguese were waiting for them.
They were waiting. They had their warships in a tight circle, but they also had smaller, faster longboats right up against the Meri. They had soldiers stationed on deck and in those boats with long pikes, with axes, with crossbows.
So anytime someone made a hole...
Every time a hatch splintered open, every time a desperate head popped up, gasping for fresh air, they were met with a spear or an arrow. They were just cut down.
It was a turkey shoot. It was a massacre.
It was a systematic slaughter. There are accounts of people managing to break a hole in the side and jump into the water, only to be speared by the sailors in the boats like fish.
This is just... It's beyond comprehension.
The Portuguese chronicles, and again, we have to keep reminding ourselves, these are the guys bragging about this, they describe these horrific scenes. They talk about men on the burning Meri managing to get to an opening and holding up their babies, trying to show the Portuguese soldiers, look, there are children here, have mercy on the children.
And the response from da Gama's men.
More fire, more arrows. There was no mercy, none. Da Gama himself watched the entire thing from the deck of his flagship. Impassive. He stayed there until the screens died down and the job was done.
You mentioned the chroniclers. There's a quote from one of them, a man named Tomé Lopes, that it stuck with me since I first read it.
It haunts anyone who reads it, I think.
After describing this absolute horror, the screaming, the smell of burning flesh, the ship slowly sinking, what does he write?
He writes, by the grace of God, not one of those Moors escaped.
By the grace of God.
That phrase tells you everything you need to know about the mindset we are dealing with. To us, sitting here 500 years later, this is a war crime. This is a crime against humanity. To Vasco da Gama and his men, this was a religious act.
It was a service to God.
It was a holy act.
Right.
They saw themselves as crusaders continuing the fight against Islam. Every Muslim killed, no matter how, was a victory for Christendom. They didn't see Fatima bint Abdullah, the mother returning from pilgrimage. They saw an infidel, an enemy of the faith.
It's a level of dehumanization that is just, it's total.
Absolute. You cannot do something like that to people you perceive as fully human. You have to reduce them to something else first, an obstacle, a pest, an idea.
So the Meri burns down to the waterline and eventually sinks, taking all 400 souls with it. The Fatima, we imagined, is gone. The captain who tried to negotiate is gone. And da Gama watches it slip beneath the waves and thinks, job well done.
He considers it a good start, a powerful opening statement, because remember, the Meri wasn't the final objective, it was just the warm-up act.
Right. The real target was the city that chartered the ship, the city of Calicut.
Exactly. So he turns his fleet and heads for the city. He arrives on October 30th, and he doesn't send a diplomat ashore to talk.
He sends cannonballs.
For 3 straight days, he bombards the city relentlessly. And again, we have to look at the targeting strategy. He isn't just trying to knock out the Zamarin's palace or the defensive walls along the harbor.
What is he hitting?
He's deliberately targeting the residential districts. He targets the warehouses on the waterfront, knowing they are the lifeblood of the city. He specifically targets the thatched roof housing where the common people lived, because it would burn so easily.
He's maximizing civilian casualties, on purpose.
He is trying to maximize pain and terror. The logic is simple. He wants the population of Calicut to be so terrified, so broken, so miserable, that they rise up in revolt and force the Zamarin to surrender to the Portuguese. It's the logic of total war applied to a trade dispute.
But even the 3-day bombardment isn't the worst part of what he does at Calicut. There's the incident with the fishermen.
This is the part of the story that is almost impossible to believe. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, except that multiple independent Portuguese sources confirm it happened exactly this way.
So what happened?
While the main fleet is blockading the harbor, da Gama's men capture a group of locals out on the water.
Were they soldiers? Part of a coastal defense force?
No, they were fishermen and some small-time traders. Just ordinary guys in small boats trying to sell rice or catch fish to feed their families. About 38 of them in total. They were pulled out of their boats and brought onto the decks of the Portuguese ships.
And they aren't held for ransom or interrogated for information?
No. Da Gama orders them to be strung up from the ship's rigging. And then he orders his men to systematically mutilate them.
We need to be specific here, as gruesome as it is, because the details speak to the intent. What did they do to them?
They cut off their hands, they cut off their ears, they cut off their noses.
While they were alive and conscious.
While they were fully conscious. One of the chronicles even mentions that the Portuguese soldiers were knocking out their teeth with hammers to stop them from biting through the gags or biting their own tongues. It was methodical assembly line torture.
And then there's the pile.
Yeah.
The boat.
Yes. They took all of these severed body parts, the hands, the ears, the noses, and they threw them into one of the small captured fishing boats, a literal pile of human flesh. Then they took the mutilated men who were bleeding out, screaming, dying, and they tossed them on top of the pile of their own limbs.
And they set the boat on fire. What did they do with it?
No, not fire. That would be too quick. They set the boat adrift and let the tide carry it toward the beach. And they attached a note written in the local language for the Zamarin.
What did the note say?
The gist of it was, I'm sending you these gifts. Why don't you make a curry out of them and feast?
My God.
It was a message of absolute contempt and boundless cruelty. This is what happens to those who resist me. This is what I am capable of. Do you really want to test me?
It is psychological warfare in its purest, sickest form.
It is, by any modern definition, terrorism. The use of spectacular violence against civilians to achieve a political aim. That is exactly what this was. He wanted to create a nightmare so vivid, so unforgettable, that the Zamorin would have no choice but to capitulate.
And even then, he wasn't done with the bodies. He turned his own ships into floating gallows.
Yes. As he finally sailed away from Calicut to go terrorize other port cities down the coast, he hung the bodies of his victims from the yardarms and the masts of his ships. Just dangling corpses swinging in the tropical wind.
A floating haunted house.
A floating warning sign.
Yeah.
A mobile atrocity exhibition. And there's a detail in one of the sources that really shows the dedication to this horrific image.
What's that?
In the tropical heat, bodies decompose very quickly. So as the bodies rotted and fell apart, he would have them taken down and replaced with fresh prisoners that he would capture and execute. He made sure the fleet always looked like a death machine.
So after laying all of this out, the burning of the Meri, the bombardment, the mutilations, we have to ask the big question. Why?
Right.
I mean, we touched on the economics and the humiliation, but this level of cruelty, it seems to go beyond strategy.
Yeah.
Was Vasco da Gama just a clinical psychopath?
Yeah.
Was this one uniquely evil man, or was this policy?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's so important. It's very easy to just dismiss da Gama as a monster. And look, by any modern standard, his actions were monstrous. But if we dismiss him as just a madman, we miss the much more terrifying point.
Which is?
This was a strategy. This was the explicit logic of the Portuguese Empire in Asia. It was policy. And it all revolved around the Cartaz system.
Okay, so explain the Cartaz again.
The Portuguese leadership, from the king down, knew they could never dominate the centuries-old Indian Ocean trade through normal commercial means. Their goods were core, their capital was limited, so they decided to change the product they were selling.
From goods to
safety. They instituted this system where any non-Portuguese ship sailing in the Indian Ocean had to buy a license from them, a cartaz.
It's a protection racket on an oceanic scale.
It's 100% a protection racket. Nice shipping lane you have there. Shame if something happened to it. If you bought the pass, you were acknowledging Portuguese sovereignty over the sea, you paid a hefty tax, and you were allowed to live. If you were caught sailing without a cartaz,
you were considered a fair price.
Exactly. You could be sunk, burned, or looted without consequence. Your crew and passengers were considered enemies of the crown.
But for a threat like that to work, the threat has to be credible. It has to be terrifyingly believable.
Bingo. That's the core of it. If the thousands of merchants across the Indian Ocean thought the Portuguese were just bluffing, or if they thought the Portuguese were civilized and would follow the normal rules of engagement in war, they might have resisted.
They might try to run the blockade or fight back or just ignore them.
Right. So da Gama understood that he had to prove that he wasn't civilized. He had to prove that he was, for lack of a better word, crazy.
He had to prove that he was a demon.
That is the exact word that shows up in the local Indian chronicles describing the Portuguese. Demons. He needed to demonstrate in the most public and horrific way possible that there was no line he would not cross. There was no act too barbaric for him to commit.
So the burning of the Meri wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It wasn't collateral damage.
No.
It was the marketing campaign.
Tragically, yes. It was the marketing campaign for the Cartaz system. The cruelty was the point. The ship was chosen because it was a pilgrim ship. Attacking the most sacred and non-threatening target imaginable was a way of demonstrating that nothing is off limits.
It was the foundational violence of the Portuguese Empire in Asia.
It was. And in the short term, you have to say, it worked.
It actually worked.
In a brutal economic sense, absolutely. The merchants across the region were terrified into submission. Many bought the Cartaz. The Portuguese were able to seize control of key ports and shipping lanes. The price of pepper in Lisbon plummeted, making the Portuguese crown fantastically wealthy. It's what funded their golden age.
But in the long term.
In the long term, it poisoned the well forever.
How so?
The Portuguese were never accepted as legitimate trading partners in most of Asia. They were always viewed as what they were at the beginning: pirates, intruders, terrorists. They faced constant rebellions, constant low-grade warfare. They had to maintain this incredible level of violence for over a century just to hold on to their small collection of fortified trading posts.
So it wasn't a sustainable empire of trade like the Dutch or the English later built.
No. It was an empire of forts and cannons, an empire built on fear, and fear is an expensive and exhausting way to rule.
I want to pivot now to how we even know all of this in such gory detail. Because usually when you hear about atrocities from 500 years ago, there's a debate.
Right, the fog of war, enemy propaganda.
Exactly. Oh, that's just the Ottomans trying to make the Portuguese look bad, or the numbers of the dead are exaggerated.
Yeah.
But here, you've said from the start, the main sources are Portuguese.
This is the most fascinating and disturbing part of the historiography. The primary sources for these events are men like Gaspar Correa and Fernão Lopes de Castanheira. These were official Portuguese chroniclers, many of whom lived and worked in Portuguese India in the 16th century.
And they weren't whistleblowers trying to expose a crime.
Far from it. They were fans. They were writing the official histories meant to glorify the Portuguese expansion, to be read by the king and future generations of Portuguese noblemen.
So when Correa describes the burning of the Meri, or the cutting off of hands and noses at Calicut,
he isn't writing it as a confession. He isn't writing with shame. He's writing it as a boast.
look how tough our guy was. Look what he did to our enemies.
Precisely. Look how thorough he was in punishing the enemies of the king and of the true faith. They wanted future generations to know that Vasco da Gama didn't flinch. They viewed this violence as necessary, as righteous, and even as an admirable display of strength.
It's absolutely incredible how values and perspectives can shift over time. They wrote it all down so it could be celebrated, and now we read the exact same text as a damning indictment.
Exactly. And for about 400 years, Western historians largely accepted the Portuguese framing of the story. They either ignored these gory details or they justified them as rough justice in a rough time, that kind of argument.
Right, boys will be boys.
Pretty much. You'd read biographies of da Gama written in the 19th or early 20th century, and the Meri incident is either a footnote or it's completely spun. They'd invent reasons like the Moors on the ship attacked first, or some other fabrication that the original sources don't support at all.
It's the great man theory of history trying to protect its heroes from their own actions.
It is. It's a deliberate sanitization. It's only really in the last few decades, as we've started to look at history from a more global perspective, a non-Eurocentric perspective, that we've gone back to those original Portuguese texts and said, wait a minute, this isn't heroism, this is mass murder.
The facts on the page didn't change. We just changed the lens we were using to look at them.
We stopped reading the text from the perspective of the man standing on the bridge of the warship, and we started trying to imagine the perspective of the woman trapped in the burning hold.
Which brings us right back to our composite character, Fatima.
It does. It always comes back to them.
We started this whole deep dive talking about statues and monuments. Vasco da Gama is everywhere. His name is written on the world. But the Meri, it's gone. Archaeologically, it's just dust.
It's at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, somewhere off the coast of Kerala. We will likely never find it. And the 400 people who are on board, we don't know a single one of their names. The Fatima narrative is a reconstruction precisely because history erased the real people. They were deemed unworthy of being remembered.
But the captain of the ship, we know a little bit about him from the records.
We do. We know he was a brave man. We know he rode to the enemy flagship. We know he offered everything he had, including his own life and freedom, to save his passengers. In any other story, he would be the hero.
Right, he's the character you build the statue for. The captain who goes down with his ship while trying to save the innocent.
But because he was on the wrong side of the Age of Discovery narrative, he's not even a footnote. He's just an anonymous part of a statistic.
He's collateral damage in someone else's story of glory.
That's a perfect way to put it.
It really makes you rethink that entire phrase, the Age of Discovery, doesn't it?
It absolutely should, because discovery implies that the place was dark and unknown until you arrived with a lantern. But the Indian Ocean in 1500 wasn't dark. It was bright. It was vibrant, interconnected, wealthy, and full of life.
Da Gama didn't turn on the lights.
In a very real and tragic way, he turned them off. He brought a darkness, a new kind of brutal, systematic violence to a part of the world that was doing just fine without him.
That's a heavy thought to end on. He brought the darkness.
It's the central paradox of so much of imperial history. The incredible wealth of Lisbon, the glory of the Portuguese Golden Age, was built directly on the ashes of the Meri. You cannot separate the two.
The beauty and the horror are linked.
They are. The beauty of the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon, which is a stunning piece of architecture, by the way, is paid for with the tax on the pepper trade. a trade that was secured by burning pilgrim ships and mutilating fishermen.
It's all hidden in plain sight.
Always, you just have to know where to look.
Well, I think that's probably the key takeaway for you listening today. History is messy. It's not a simple fairy tale of good guys and bad guys, but sometimes there are definitely bad guys. And sometimes they're the ones we put on our stamps and name our bridges after.
And it's our job centuries later to go back and read the fine print, to read their own words and see what they were so proud of.
We hope this deep dive gave you a new, if difficult, lens to look at the year 1502. It's certainly not the happiest story we've ever told, but it feels like a necessary one.
Absolutely. Thanks for exploring it with us.
We'll catch you on the next one. Take care.
Goodbye.